Thanks for joining our monthly community webcast. I'm Jürgen Kress, part of the Oracle Integration Product Management team supporting you as a partner. In case you missed one of our webcasts, on-demand recordings are available. For details, please see our monthly community web newsletter or visit Oracle Video Hub. In today's presentation, Greg Malley and Deepak Arora will talk about identity propagation across SaaS solutions. One of the big challenges that Oracle Integration Cloud developers like you face in any outbound REST call required a user identity. In A-team fashion, a solution including a proven pattern and a demo will be presented. Good morning, Greg.
Well, hello, everybody.
Thank you much for joining. And good morning, Deepak.
Good morning to everybody. Good afternoon or good evening, wherever you guys are. Thank you for having us.
Please feel free to post your questions via the conference Q&A tool or Twitter #PassCommunity. At the end of the webcast, we will answer them. Slides are available at the community workspace. Please do tweet or blog about products and services which are available today. Please do not blog about future roadmap. For today's agenda, I will start with a brief community update and then hand over to the A-team to talk about Oracle Identity Propagation. We will wrap up the call with a call to action and answer your questions. So let's get started. We are running a series of Digital Assistant, the Oracle Chatbot Solution hands-on training. It's a 4-series seminar which takes place today and Thursday, plus we recorded the first 2 sessions. If you still like to join, please visit bit.ly/ODA April 2021. We would like to announce RT. RT is a bot designed to answer your digital assistant questions. You can ask, for example, RT, what a digital assistant is, what languages it supports, and it will point you to the right place at the documentation. Please visit bit.ly/RTbot. In case you missed one of our webcasts, on-demand recordings are available at the Video Hub. Please watch and subscribe to our channel and share your content. For more information about Oracle Digital Assistant, developer tools, and application development, please subscribe to our developer partner community newsletter. For information about application integration, process automation, and innovation, please subscribe to our past partner community newsletter. With this short introduction, I would like to hand over to you, Greg.
All right. Well, welcome. And what we're presenting today, I sure hope you find valuable. And let's get going here. As Jürgen had mentioned, what we're presenting today is a pattern that allows the identity of a user as a client to be propagated from the client through the PaaS layer, the integration cloud, all the way to FA. And here is the problem statement that we used to go ahead and drive this particular example and pattern. And a quick shout out for a colleague that helped develop this particular example is Mike Muller. I believe he's in the audience today and was unable to be able to present today. But in the event that there are some things that he worked on that that comes up and may need some clarification, he is available if we can, if that is a need. So anyways, here's the problem statement at hand. It says, how can an Oracle integration developer ensure that the invoking user's identity gets passed along to the Fusion applications call? All right, so the big challenge that we have with this particular pattern is, if you look at the Fusion application APIs, there, especially if you are using something like OAuth, what you have is you are required to have a JSON web token, JWT, with a subject. Basically, what that subject does is it identifies the person that is making the request to that API. Now, one of the other challenges in the OIC layer or in the integration cloud layer portion is OIC, due to security reasons, et cetera, does not expose the authentication header or anything along those lines that we could, within our integration, be able to tap into to help with, making that call. And in addition to that, if you look at the connections and the adapters within Integration Cloud, when you're configuring those particular connections, they are tied to a single user. And there is, at this point, no way to dynamically swap that particular user out for each of the calls. So those were the challenges that we were faced as we were moving forward with this particular solution. All right, so our use case here is we approach this from a Oracle Cloud's technology stack perspective. That is, from the client through the PaaS layer to the FA to the Fusion apps target or end our environment. We are using the Oracle Cloud stack. So what that means is in our particular case, the user is going to log into a visual builder application, and through that application, the application is going to call or trigger an Integration Cloud orchestration. That particular orchestration is then going to be able to do the appropriate work, and we'll go into the details here in a minute, to do a user assertion within the identity cloud service layer to get the appropriate token to then call into FA, get the results, orchestrate those results, and pass them back to the visual builder application, and then display those results. Now, again, the note here is the identity of the person that is logged into that visual builder application must flow end to end. So this is the particular use case that we are leveraging within our particular sample here. So here's a very high level flow of what we're going to cover today in these slides. Basically what you have is you have your visual builder application. The person logs in, they get the JWT from the Integration Cloud layer or the OIC layer. We will leverage OCI functions to go ahead and do some of the legwork for us so that we can then call into the Fusion associated Fusion application identity cloud service instance to do a user assertion to retrieve the appropriate web token that we then use to call the Fusion apps API and get our results. All right, so at this point, let's go ahead and take a peek at the whole IDCS configuration, which is really, if you look at this in terms of the whole use case, this is the area which I think most people get hung up in. The rest of it is fairly straightforward, but your key and to this solution is doing your IDCS configuration both on the OIC side as well as the FA or the Fusion app side. So the things that you need to make sure of that'll make your life easier. So number one there, make sure that your Visual Builder and your Integration Cloud are provisioned together. And typically when you provision an OIC instance, you will get Visual Builder in addition to Integration Cloud, as well as some other features of OIC. The next thing that needs to happen is you need to set up federated SSO between FA and OIC. And here we've provided a link for you. And
hey, Greg, just a quick sec. Sorry to interrupt,
yes.
Folks. Can you, if you have any questions, there's a Q&A box at the bottom. Please click on that and post your questions in the Q&A. I'm trying to answer them as we go along. We'll try, if there's some questions that you have that we want to answer live, we'll do that. So if you're raising a hand, we're not going to get to your question until it's in the Q&A box. So please use that instead. Thank you.
Yep, and to that point, and thanks, Dee, for jumping in. I think one of the things that's important here is yes, we have a Q&A session, but I think if there are certain topics that come up that we can clarify as we're proceeding through the presentation, I think that provides a lot of value because it keeps the context of
Greg, it's very hard.
question.
It's very hard to do that because you're focusing on the presentation. So let's stick to the regular format of answering the question at the end.
Okay. But okay, fair enough. But if there is something real pressing, please don't hesitate to interrupt me. So awesome. All right. So getting back, so federation between the FA instance and the OIC instance is very important here, because what that does is that gives us visibility to all of the users across all of the instances. All right. So so step number 2, that is one of the other important, is a important step. So number 3, when you're configuring OIC IDCS application, if you have, and say for instance, a client that is outside of Visual Builder, you may have to do an extra step in terms of configuring OIC, an IDCS application, to be able to leverage OAuth to trigger an integration. And I do have a blog that goes through that we can share. But when you have Visual Builder and Integration Cloud provisioned together, they know about each other very well. And so that particular step is less complicated for that, basically within our scenario, since we are using Visual Builder. So the one thing that we do have to do within Visual Builder is there is a small configuration that we will do to trigger an OIC integration using user assertion, and we'll see that as part of this presentation as well. And if we can get to it, I can show you that in a demo as well. And then I think the more complicated setup would be on the FA IDCS application side, where we have to configure the JWT assertion as a trusted application so that OIC can do the user assertion flow and get the appropriate web token and be able to call Fusion apps on behalf of the user. So as you can see, there are four primary steps associated with that, where you generate a public-private key pair for signing, and we'll go into more of that in a bit. We then create a new confidential application, and under that client configuration for that application, you select trusted, and you upload these particular, or the public key portion of this public-private key pair, and then you add the appropriate scope. And once we have all of that in place, the rest of it, I think, is fairly straightforward. All right, so let's take a look at the IDCS configuration for this highlighted piece here, basically the Visual Builder into Integration Cloud. All right, I don't know if this is too small or not, but if you're familiar with the IDCS console, when you're creating an application, the key pieces here is that we want to configure our IDCS application to allow JWT assertion. JWT assertion is also synonymous with user assertion. They're used interchangeably. And the other thing is if you are creating a new application, you need to add the appropriate scope of your OIC instance as a resource to this application. And if you see down here, I've highlighted this section where this particular scope, which is found in the pre-configured application associated with your Integration Cloud instance. This scope exists. You simply, when you add a scope, you go through the list, pick this, and add it to your application. And from that point forward, as a client, and if you have the client ID and secret, you can then go ahead and get the appropriate user assertion token to trigger an integration cloud integration. And as I mentioned before, that I do have a blog out there that walks through how this particular step is done. Then from the visual builder perspective, you simply go into your server configuration, and what this does is this gives you the ability to specify the OIC instance. We're going to use the user assertion, as I said before, get the client ID for the application that we set up in Integration Cloud, and then that scope that I identified previously as well, you specify those there, and that is pretty much it. At that point, Visual Builder can see various endpoints that you can select from Integration Cloud, and you can pick the one appropriate for your particular use case. All right, the next component that we need, or next section that we really need to focus on, is the FA-IDCS application configuration. And this is the highlighted piece here, where what we're doing is we're setting up how Integration Cloud, now that we have, okay, if you look at the flow, let's say that the Visual Builder application has made a call and has triggered an Integration Cloud instance or orchestration. This orchestration then will need to be able to communicate and get an appropriate web token from the FA IDCS instance that basically is saying, hey, I need to be able to call FA as a trusted application on behalf of this user that is making this request.
So one thing I want to make clear, one thing I want to make clear, I know, Greg, I'm watching the questions. The FA identity service down here is not the pre-configured identity IDCS service that comes with OIC. This is the identity cloud service that is associated with the FA instance. So it's two different IDCS instances that we're referring to. So it's not the one that comes pre-configured with OIC when you provision an OIC instance.
Yep, and that is a big point of confusion for a lot of folks, is that when you get a Fusion application environment, you get an associated IDCS with that environment. Just the same, when you provision an OIC instance, you also get an identity cloud service associated with your OIC instance. They are separate. And so, again, that's why going back and doing the federation between your Fusion application and the IDC instance here with your OIC instance, all of your users are then known across all the environments. But, you know, to reinforce what Dee was just saying, this is the configuration that is important, because this particular IDCS configuration is going to allow Integration Cloud to make a invoke into Fusion applications as a trusted application. All right, so if we look back, if you recall the 4 steps that on the bulleted slide that led into this topic, this is the IDCS page that is, relates to those particular points. That is, we are configuring a trusted application within the Fusion Applications IDCS instance, where we are enabling the JWT assertion or the user assertion grant type. Here is where we take our public key from the public and private key pair that we generated previously or earlier, and we go ahead and import that public key here. All right, and then we specify a scope that will be used later for the user assertion from OIC that will help identify that OIC can indeed make a trusted FA call or a call to FA using the REST APIs. All right. Now we get into that portion right there was really focused on the IDCS configuration side. Now what we're getting into is more of just the bare bones code, the stuff that we need to put together in order to make everything flow from end to end. So we're going to take a look first at the OCI function and what it comprises and what its role is within this particular solution to the pattern. All right. So the function, what it does is it will produce a payload that is ready to be used to make a call, a REST-based call to the Fusion Apps IDCS instance to get the user assertion web token necessary to make the Fusion Apps REST API call. All right, we do have a link that we're providing within those slides here that you can look and get additional details on. Now, how the function does this is it needs the subject, i.e. the user's ID that is making the request, basically the Visual Builder user who has logged into the Visual Builder application, their ID, and then an appropriate IDCS scope that we configured within our application in the previous step that I showed you on the IDCS FA IDCS console. All right, with those two pieces of information, the function will access the OCI vault. And the reason that we're using the OCI vault is we have sensitive information that we want to securely store. And that is the private key of that public and private key that we generated, in addition to the client ID for the FA application that we configured within the FA IDCS instance. Those are two very sensitive pieces of information. And so that was one of the driving factors of why we chose to use functions and also using the OCI vault to safely store those. All right. So once we get those two pieces of information, what happens is the function will generate two other web tokens or web tokens for our assertion. There is a user assertion token that is created and signed using the private key, and then also a client assertion web token that is generated and also signed, such that the two of those together are passed to the FA IDCS instance from the integration, and we'll see that in a minute, to get the actual web token that will be used to make the FA call. So all of this stuff is generated within the function and then is returned as just a raw string to our integration cloud orchestration. All right, and if you take a look, here is a sample, what the sample output looks like. And in comparing it to the documentation, the Oracle documentation for making a curl call to the same API that we're going to use this string in, you can compare and contrast how this fits in as the payload for this particular call. All right, and what I've highlighted here is that this particular highlighted area up here, this is the user assertion web token. And then this one down here is the trusted application or the client assertion. Now, all right, now we get into some of the fun stuff, right? We've got all of this plumbing, all this good kind of stuff in place. Now we're going to go ahead and just simply focus from the PaaS layer, where we will leverage our OCI function and our FA IDCS so that we can make a call into the Fusion application to retrieve information that we are going to orchestrate, and hopefully, if the JWT is correct, and we as a user that is making the call is allowed, we should be able to get the results back for that particular user. All right. So from an OIC integration perspective, what we're going to do is we create a simple integration that is, it is a REST triggered integration. What it will do is it will get the assertion payloads from the function and take that particular string that's brought back, and we will make a call to the IDCS endpoint on the Fusion app side with that payload, and it is a plain text payload. And there is, you may wonder why I provided a link to a blog that I did. Calling an endpoint with a plain text payload requires a little trick, and we'll cover that here in just a moment. But I have a blog that walks through how to make that plain text REST API call. All right. One of the key pieces to making that, once we get that web token back from IDCS, the key thing here to making the FA call is setting that, or setting the authentication header as a bearer token, using that token that came back from IDCS when we make that REST API call. And so once that's done, we'll then take the payload that comes back. We will pick and choose the information that is important that we want to surface to our Visual Builder application, and then return that back and display the results. Okay, so if you look at the piece, or basically the mapper, when we're getting set up to call the OCI function, if you recall, I had mentioned that we need the user's ID in order to pass in addition to the scope, for us to get the appropriate assertion web tokens from the function call. There is a feature that came to OIC, or Integration Cloud, back in 2020 called integration metadata. And if you haven't seen this before, go ahead and create an integration and take a peek within one of the mappers, and you will see that there is now this integration metadata piece where there are various bits of information associated with this integration that you have access to. And in our particular case, it's very nice. We have this invoked by, which contains the ID of the user that is triggering this particular integration. Now, I want to make something clear here. This invoked by is not populated 100% of the time. And the reason being is there are various ways that you can trigger integrations. And one of those is using client credentials OAuth. And this particular scenario, if you think about client credentials from an OAuth perspective, the primary use case for client credentials is when you have a machine-to-machine integration or flow. And so there really isn't a user associated with that particular flow. And since there is no user, you can't populate that invoked by field. So the key thing here is if you're using basic authentication or OAuth, where you have a subject identified within your JWT, this will be populated all the time. All right, so we use that and we make our function call. All right, the function returns that string that we saw earlier, Now here is the bit of the little trick that I was telling you about when making a plain text REST-based call. So we're in this particular mapper, we are getting ready to trigger a IDCS REST API on the Fusion apps instance. And what we need to do is take that string that was returned from the function and pass that along in that call. And if you look as on the target side, it requires a stream reference, and all we have is a raw string. So we use this little trick here where we encode to base 64 the assertion string, and then immediately we decode it to a base 64 reference. And what that does is that takes and brings back a file reference that is passed along to the REST adapter to then make that call with a plain string payload. Excuse me. So kind of a fun little trick, and it works well. All right, and then once we have that, once that returns, we then have our bearer token, and we're ready to make our call to FA using that particular bearer token. All right, and if you look in the mapper at this point, prior to making the FA call, the key piece is here's our access token. We are going to do a map over to the authorization header on our within our REST adapter configuration here. We take the work work email, because the thing is what we're doing is this authorization is saying I am this particular user that is requesting some information. The API that we're using here is we are trying to retrieve some person absence details. And so we are specifying a different ID here to retrieve information from FA about a person's absence reports and all that sort of stuff. And so what's cool about this is if this person in this bearer token is not authorized to access this information, it'll get rejected. But if they're allowed in FA to do that, then the results will be returned. All right. So what happens is that information is returned from FA. We map it as part of our return payload, and we send it back to the visual application, and then it gets displayed. So these are some of the miscellaneous points I wanted to pull out. And I mentioned earlier that basically the justification, or not justification, but the reasons that we used functions, and that was to leverage the OCI vault for the sensitive information that's necessary. The integration cloud libraries, I don't know if you're familiar with that, but basically what that is Node.js or JavaScript. You can create basically some JavaScript and import those into Integration Cloud and have access to them natively within Integration Cloud. Now, one of the reasons we didn't take that approach is that we didn't take the time to investigate how we could safely store that private key and application ID when using JavaScript in Integration Cloud. Again, that would be a use case I would love to see and would love to go through. But for us, it was much easier just to leverage the OCI vault. Now, point 3, I think, is very, very important. You can get performance gains, and if you are planning on taking advantage of this pattern within your implementation, it is highly recommended that you also implement JWT caching. And basically what that means is that when you request a user assertion, say within your integration, when we call to the FA IDCS instance and get a valid web token to make the FA call, that web token by default, and of course this is configurable, but by default is valid for 1 hour. So technically we do not need to re-request if a user is continuing within that hour to make calls to FA. So by caching, the idea here is once you have a valid token, put it in a cache. When that user assertion comes in, do a check against the cache to see if you have a valid token already that's not expired. Return it without having to go to IDCS. So you could potentially, and this bullet point here is, or these 2 bullet points here is just kind of a suggestion. You could create a common subflow that handles all of this logic and use a local invoke activity from all of your other integrations that might be leveraging this cache, basically your whole JWT flow. Make it a subflow, use local invoke, and then let the subflow go ahead and deal with all of that nitty-gritty caching. Now, one of the things I wanted to show you, and unfortunately I'm not able to, but Mike Moeller and I have all of the samples for this solution coming and going to be publicly available in GitHub shortly. We're hoping within the next week or 2, you will have the function, you'll have the VB application, as well as the integration and all of the documentation necessary to get that up and going. Here is the user identity application that we put together. It's very simple, very straightforward. I had mentioned before that if you go into the services configuration, what you'll do is, this is where we do our configuration to talk to the OIC instance that implements this particular flow for us, the get person and absence details. This is an integration that we'll look at here in just a moment. And if this will look familiar to you if you are an OIC developer. Here is our endpoint, and here is within Visual Builder, we can go ahead and take a look at the details associated with this, the requests, the potential response, and yes, there is a weird email. There is a person out there within our FA instance that has some.email at example.com. So I'm going to test this really quick to make sure that this endpoint is functioning and accessible from Visual Builder just in general. Now, please note that this is, because of my network and everything, this has been a little bit slow. But also note that usually the first call to the function has a little bit of delay to get everything primed and working, but subsequent calls after that flow fairly well. Also, while we're waiting here, I do want to say that Mike and I presented this to one of our customers in late 2020, and they took the information and implemented their own version of this, not only from a Visual Builder perspective, but they also have Apex clients, and they're using this in their production environment today. So this pattern is proven and is working in a real world scenario.
So Greg, while this is loading, I'm going to start with some questions that I want you to answer live, right? Okay, sure. I think we'll if you can't get your demo, we've got about 17 minutes left, so maybe we can use some time to do this. Okay. So there's a question that has been asked a few times of using. So first question that I'm going to say is, how do you use this solution if VBS is standalone? Then how will it work? So you want to answer that one?
Okay, yeah, sure. So if VBS is standalone, I touched base a little bit on it already. You can configure your integration cloud or OIC instance to be triggered using OAuth from any client. It doesn't. It can be VB, and I just mentioned it could be Apex. It could be a Java application. It could be whatever you want. And so what you would do is for the VB instance that's standalone is you would, for the VB, excuse me, let me back up. For the integration cloud instance, you go into the IDCS associated with your integration cloud, and you configure an application that provides user assertion and all that kind of stuff, the appropriate scope. And then within your standalone VB application, in this particular services configuration, you just point at that instance.
So essentially, guys, the short answer is anything that is standalone, you would do it just like you would go and create an application in the IDCS instance associated with OIC, right? That basically means that any application with that user role can access OIC and just call the REST endpoint as you would outside, and then just make sure you can authenticate. So that's what it is, whether you're using Apex or Visual Standalone VB or some other standalone client, that's just the normal way of accessing an OIC endpoint is through an IDCS application for which you are registered. Let me ask you another question, Greg. So does the OIC token exchange app count as an IDCS custom app? And if so, is there a licensing impact?
From a licensing perspective, I don't have the answer to that. However, I will bring this up. So one of the challenges that IDCS brings to the table is if you have a lot of requests going against IDCS, it has built-in basically security measures for things like denial of service. You know, basically, if it identifies a surge in requests, it will say, hey, too many requests, and basically say, hey, you need to slow down, I'm detecting a problem, yada, yada, yada.
It has rate limiting.
Yep. And so and this kind of goes back to that last bullet point that I spoke to. Having JWT caching in place takes that scenario and puts it way, way down the list, if basically out of the picture, because you're not for every single request going against IDCS to get a token. All right. So again, that's going to be key to your implementation. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but I think it's a valid point you should know regardless.
Yeah, I mean, as far as it does count as a custom application, but whether or not there's any licensing, I'm not sure that the licensing that I've seen contains any limitation on that number of applications, but we'd have to verify that. I don't have a clear answer.
So I don't know who the anonymous attendee is who keeps asking me this question about, is this an IDCS user pricing based or? So there's two different IDCS instances. One is that when you create an OIC instance, you get an IDCS stripe, and the IDCS instance we're talking to is associated with FA. Now, I'm going to answer this question. You can use a third-party IDP, which means that you can use Okta or Microsoft Active Directory or anything else as your identity store, and then federate the users from that to IDCS. To access FA, you will have to go through IDCS. This is not a standalone IDCS instance. It is the one that comes associated with FA. So does it have any license implications? We'll find out, but this is not the singular IDCS instance that you buy, which is managed by number of users.
Okay, it looks like we're back. So I don't know if you all have been watching or not, but
You
the
can
visual builder application.
we can see your screen,
Okay.
so you can walk us briefly through the demo, please. Thank you.
Okay, yep. So here I went ahead and made a call. So let me go back here. I tested the application here, or excuse me, the endpoint here. We saw that we did get the information back that we were hoping to get. So we know it works. In our Visual Builder application, this is just a simple table. And what it does is displays all of this information associated with this particular user. And I am calling in to FA as Casey Brown. So I'm logged in as this user, Casey Brown. So when I make the FA call, I'm saying, hi, I'm Casey Brown. I am looking for employee absence details for this given user. And in this particular case, it's some.user@example.com, okay? Now, if we come over here to the integration cloud layer, we can see that here is the call that was made, you know, to this particular integration. I'm not going to go into the steps here. You'll be able to do that once our asset is publicly available. But what we can do is we can come in here and take a look. Since I've got tracing on, we can see what's going on within the flow here. So if we go into the data mapper, oops, that's not what I wanted. So this is the mapper that we are calling, that's going to be used to call into the OCI function. If you notice, we have a principal, which is the user, Casey Brown, and then a scope that is associated with it that will be used within the function to create the assertion token that we're going to use to make the call to IDCS later. So this isn't the one that I want. Oh, sorry, it's right here. So when we make this call, here is that assertion that has been created by the function itself. And if you look, the first part up here, this is the user assertion piece, or the token associated with the user portion. And if we look at that and go over to jwt.io, we can take a look at it and say, oh, check it out. It is a valid web token. And here is the assertion. This is basically saying, hey, this is Casey Brown, and this is, you know, the information that's going to be handed to IDCS to do a user assertion grant type. Now for the client assertion piece, basically saying, hey, is OIC valid to actually make this call to FA? That's the second piece. We can take a look at this web token, and we can see that, you know, this right here is the client ID. And then this is some of the other information that's needed in order to use the FA IDCS instance to validate whether or not we can return a valid web token to make the FA call. So once we have that string, this is, let me see, this is kind of fun. So this was this mapping that I was telling you about for making a string REST call. If you remember the string reference that I pointed out, that little trick resulted in this particular entry within the mapper. So we can see that we now have a file reference so that we can make our call to IDCS. And what it does is it then returns back this valid web token right here. We can check that also within JWT.io. Paste this in here. And this is the valid user assertion JWT that we then map as the bearer token for the call into FA. And if you look, we have that particular mapping, sorry, my bad, server, send, yeah, let's just take a look right here. So this is the outbound FA call. you can see that the authorization header for that particular REST call is that token that was returned. And then, of course, we prefix it with bearer to make it a syntactically correct authorization header.
So
there we go.
Greg, if you go back to your diagram, I want to cover a couple of things. This is Deepak here.
Sure.
So a lot of people have asked on the Q&A, do we have to use OIC for this solution? What if we want to just go from VBCS to FA? So in this diagram, the answer is you can absolutely do that, right? You can write your own, but what you have to remember that to propagate the user identity from FA, from Visual Builder to FA, you're going to have to write some code. This piece in the middle, and I'm going to annotate, Greg, if you don't mind.
Okay, yep, that's awesome.
I'm not allowed to annotate. Okay.
Oh, well, let me see if I can annotate, and hopefully I'll oh, I don't think I can annotate either.
Okay. So there's this box in the middle, this integration cloud is doing a couple of things. It's talking to the OCI function to get the two tokens, one for identity propagation and one for the user assertion, right? So user assertion and then also access. I'm going to call it an access token. Now, if in addition to that, OIC could be doing a lot of data aggregation, it could be doing some transformations, and essentially, it is the data layer for VB, right? You're able to do that. So it then talks to the IDCS instance and gets, once it passes all the header information to FA, then you get all the results from Fusion applications. Now, the question is, can you do this without OIC? Absolutely, you could do this within Visual Builder, but then you have to have some sort of way to mimic the code of that's going to call and get you an OCI function. Could you put an API gateway in front of Fusion applications? You could. It's not going to be simple. Or you could have some other code to do this. Point being is that the only reason OIC is being used because it is performing a bigger function than just federating the user, right?
Yeah. Originally, we wanted to do, show like a aggregation use case where you're creating a coarser grained API on top of some finer grained APIs where you have to do some, multiple calls and then take the data responses and combine them into one payload back to, so more of a complicated case in a simple individual API call.
Yeah, I mean, if it's a very simple use case, just to stick with that diagram, Greg, sorry. If it's a very simple use case, go ahead.
Well, what I was pointing out is I believe there are 2 FA calls here. I think we're leveraging 2 API calls. So we are doing exactly what Mike was saying.
Yeah.
We're using 2 APIs to basically orchestrate a single payload back to Visual Builder.
So I'm going to answer Pawan's question. That it feels like it's simpler with the OCI gateway. It might be. It's not always the case. The OCI gateway, the API gateway can perform, if you put OCI gateway in front of VB, let's say you want to get a bearer token there, which you want to then propagate downstream to avoid part of the steps, it can be done. Setting up the API gateway as a front end to Fusion applications, not sure how many of you have tried that. It's not an easy operation to complete. I'm not saying that it can't be done, but it's not something that you would usually typically do because FA has its own kind of API gateway embedded within the deployment. So all I'm saying is that, yes, you can bypass OIC and do all of this through a functions call from VB, but you're going to have to orchestrate the code within something that VB does or through API gateway. Absolutely.
Yep. One other key thing I forgot to touch base on. One of the things that was brought up in some other discussions that Mike and I had with various folks on this, they were saying, why not do everything within the OCI function? Why come out and make that call to FA IDCS from Integration Cloud? One of the things that we were trying to do was to leverage as much out of the box capabilities and functionality as possible within the Oracle Cloud Stack. And yes, functions is part of that cloud stack, but one of the things that we were hoping is that there are certain features within the REST adapter, i.e., if you're doing OAuth and you have that OAuth user and everything, there is web token caching that is part of that particular adapter. And we were hoping that we could potentially leverage that. But at the moment, we cannot do that. So, and that's why we would have to implement that elsewhere. But
so one of the things that I want to point out is in the February release of OIC, OAuth support has been added to the Fusion Apps adapters. Absolutely there. So you can now use an OAuth code credentials to propagate, to call FA, right, using the adapters. It's not a challenge, but one of the things that is missing, it's not dynamic. So you have to configure that. Part of this beauty of this solution is that this can be absolutely dynamic in terms of any user that is registered to use FA can now be propagated instead of using a single user aspect. Now, again, I'm not saying that that's the case. We're using a REST-based call here so we're using a REST call. We're not using the adapters because at the time when this solution was started, those features weren't there. So there are certain things that as things progress, we would be able to use a lot of the out-of-the-box functionality as it comes up. So stay tuned that this is probably something that we will enhance as we go along. But for now, if you want to use a user propagation scenario, which is not currently fully supported in OIC, this would be the way to go.
Yeah, and just to add a little bit to that, any of the adapters, again, the REST adapter allows you access to the security headers within the outbound call. If other adapters allow that, you can use other adapters for this because then you can go ahead and map the bearer token yourself. That's the key piece there.
Yeah, and now in the February release, you're able to access the SOAP adapter headers. So this would also a solution you could use with the SOAP adapter, should you choose to use that approach.
Greg and Deepak, thank you for a wonderful presentation. Clearly can see the real world experience you have from many customer implementations where the A team is supporting. To wrap up the presentation, in case you're not yet a member in the integration and process partner community to receive the regular information and newsletter, please make sure that you register now at tinyurl.com/oracleic. In case you would like to try Oracle integration, you can get a free trial at the Oracle website, or you can get the access to the playground for partners. You read the community newsletter, you find all details in there. And if you have questions, you can post them at our community Slack channel, or you can visit the Oracle Video Hub to watch the on-demand webcasts. Key resource of today's webcast is the A-Team blog. Deepak, you would like to mention something about the A-Team blog and how you can support partners?
Sure. So within our team, the blog, thank you, Jürgen, for sharing the site. We call it the A-Team Chronicles. We're actively publishing blogs, video blogs, and also something we're calling our asset repository, which is actual livable, downloadable, executable code. So this solution that Mike and Greg have worked upon will be available as a fully executable solution that you can download, review, and run. If you are going to modify this, please make sure you give appropriate references to the authors here. But the A-Team blog is active. We're actively publishing a good 10 to 12 blogs a month. So please keep accessing it. There's a lot of content over there from an OIC, ODA, security, networking, and other kind of PaaS for SaaS topics as well.
Excellent. Thank you very much for attending. If you have questions, make sure you reach out to your Oracle Partner Manager. You can also contact Greg, Deepak, or myself. And thanks for the excellent presentation. Thank you for attending, and we are looking forward to welcome you at one of our next community webcasts. Greg, Deepak, thank you very much.